digitaljamsessions.com. Thank you for joining me today, and if you've been following us from the beginning, you'll have noticed that the audio quality might slightly have improved today. That is because I had the joy of visiting Denmark Street in London, and if you happen to have a chance to go down there, you should explore the magical mysteries that is what must be the music hub of London. I didn't expect that I would necessarily find what I was looking for, but it turns out there are a lot of music shops around Denmark Street, and they certainly know their stuff. So shout out to the amazing stores around Denmark Street who helped me find my lovely new microphone, which is the CO1U Pro apparently. So hopefully you can hear an improvement in the quality, certainly from my end. What I will say right now is please bear with me. The sound quality of my guest today is not as good as it could be. Unfortunately, somebody decided to sit in a room that was not as quiet as they had initially thought. So if you hear a lot of additional sounds, that's just because they are in an open plan office, such as the nature of entrepreneurial startups and the centre of London. So if you can bear with it, we will gradually improve the quality of these sessions as we move forward. So I thank you for your patience and please do enjoy. Today we're joined by Tiffany from Future 8 and Oliver from QWERTY Films. We'll also have Joe Barnes, who is a social enterprise expert and has worked with numerous big brands and also non-profits. So, without further ado, I'm going to let Joe speak for himself and explain exactly what he does.
My work varies from working with big brands, from social communications, from Sky to Renault, right through to working with charities, Desmond Tutu Foundation and Co. on specific ways of furthering their messages using digital platforms. And the past 6 months have been very focused on digital startups with a social enterprise thread.
Thank you, Joe. And Oliver, if you can explain a little bit more to us about what you do at QWERTY.
Well, I'm the head of production and development here at QWERTY, which is a sort of, I guess, a sort of silly way of saying that I read a lot and make sure stuff gets done. Basically, it's my job to find new material and develop new material to the point at which it could become a feature film, a fully financed and cast feature film. And then once we have a film in production, to weigh in on any production issues that are ongoing, whether it's, it could be day-to-day things like budget and scheduling, it could be stuff to do with the finance, it could be liaising with sales agents and distributors, that kind of thing. Okay. So it's quite a nefarious role.
And for those of us who haven't heard of QWERTY Films, can you tell us maybe a couple of titles that QWERTY have released?
Sure. It's the company was set up by Michael Kuhn, who used to run Polygram Films, and titles we've done are things like The Duchess with Keira Knightley, I Heart Huckabees, the David O. Russell film, and most recently Sweet Française, which is actually in cinemas at the moment.
Wonderful, thank you. And Tiffany, if you can explain to us all about SuperAwesome, but more importantly about the wonderful Future 8 Awards.
Sure. So SuperAwesome is the largest marketing and discovery platform for kids and teens globally. And then another huge part of what we do is based around research and insights and really keeping an eye on what kids and teens are up to and what they're into. So I kind of do business development within that and look at new opportunities and new things within the market. So we identified that there are lots of kids and teens who are developing their own apps, creating their own content, and really being superstars from a really young age. So we wanted to find and reward those kids who are already doing great things within digital skills and link them up with companies, kind of international companies who could help them develop their skill. And we also wanted to encourage kids who haven't necessarily developed those skills yet to get involved. So we set up the Future 8 Awards with in partnership with The Guardian. We run that as a yearly thing to give kids great opportunities within technology.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, guys. And welcome to the Digital Jam Sessions. So Today, we are going to kick off with a discussion around the evolution of franchise IP and the key trends for cross-platform development. Now, because you're late to the conversation, Oliver, we were gossiping between Joe and Tiffany and I, and we had a little think about some of these kind of topic areas. And one of the really interesting things that Tiffany brought up was this notion that actually maybe the next step for film marketing isn't necessarily around social media, but around other platforms. So, Tiff, why don't you explain yourself so that Oliver can be caught up?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at the kids market, kind of pre 13 years old, as we know, 13-year-olds shouldn't be on Facebook. They aren't really allowed to be on YouTube, but of course they all are. But pre that age, where there's really a big migration onto social platforms, there are certain virtual worlds that kids spend all of their time playing. And there have been a couple of examples where IP has actually been launched through these virtual worlds in the US, and that IP has then gone on to become a kind of global success. So a really good example of that is Diary of a Wimpy Kid, that initially launched on Funbrain. So the book initially launched on this virtual world for kids. The whole book, all the entirety of that content was given away. And at the time, everybody said, this isn't going to work. You've given away the content for free. But it's now, been made into movies. It's a huge, huge global franchise that all stemmed from launching on a platform for kids.
Well, I mean, I think it's very interesting. And I think, it's interesting that Tiffany's saying that everyone was saying, well, you're giving the IP away for free and therefore it's a bad idea. I think certainly there's a consensus that, for example, the feature film world has been quite slow on the uptake with some of these digital platforms. I think it's beginning to get a bit better, but certainly that under 13 audience, getting some of that content through is quite difficult. I think partly, because setting up those IP brands is such a nuanced thing. I mean, it's interesting the crossover you have on a business sense, as well as on a distribution sense, because something like Peppa Pig, has been propping up certain distributors' film production for a long time. The money from that has supported all sorts of endeavours. But I think it's very exciting. I think how you can develop IP for feature films through that kind of Diary of a Wimpy Kid model certainly is going to develop a lot more. But I think it's a lot of poking around in the dark at the moment. But maybe that's just me being recalcitrant and typically film.
So what do you have to say on that one, Joe? Bearing in mind you're our social media expert of the day, do you think that this is something that is becoming an emerging trend?
I think it's actually boils back a little bit to a wider problem, and that's that the speed of digital communications is evolving so quickly that the standard regulations and frameworks we have to measure and judge and regulate things in industries, they're not catching up. So it's taking quite significant peaks of activity and incidents almost to disrupt the norm and make people, or force organisations and industry regulatory bodies to think again and think about how they need to work with things. And I'm referring specifically here to examples like the interview, for instance, which I'm sure you're all much better versed than I am in terms of the dynamics of how it launched and how Sony launched it through. But this isn't just relevant to the film industry, it's relevant to various different industries where the ways and the frameworks that are allowed traditionally and the methods of doing things, the way that they're measured are much, much, much more out of date than in any other communications platform from my experience.
It's interesting that you say this, Joe, because I also wonder if perhaps there is also a kind of a mismatch in terms of the way that people are creating content. And Tiffany's reference to the idea that IP be given out there freely to the world and through a different medium such as a virtual world. I think this is something that we're beginning to see more and more of, which is people exploring different ways to actually get their IP into the world in the first place. And things like crowdfunded projects, for example, I think is a very interesting area. Oliver, what's your view on crowdfunded film? Do we feel that the quality there just isn't good enough to really cut it, or do we feel that is something that can stand on its own 2 feet in this digital economy we live in?
Oh no, I think it's a fantastic thing. I mean, of course, the thing with crowdfunding is it's in part the money, but actually, in large part, it's about building your audience from before you've even started making the movie. And having people feel that they are a part of it, and that is genuine. And there's something very beautiful in that, and very wonderful. I think, personally, I take a bit of issue when, someone's made millions and millions of dollars in being in a hit TV show and then goes onto a crowdfunding website. I think I take a bit of a dim view of that, but for emerging filmmakers, it's absolutely fantastic, and it's just what the industry needed, because it's still, people think that digital has made filmmaking very cheap. Well, actually, it hasn't.
So on that basis, Alan and Nathan, is that for you somebody that cynically shouldn't be using Indiegogo, or do you feel that that's the right place for them?
Run me through them. I'm not familiar with what you're talking about.
Sorry, Alan and Nathan were on a TV show called Firefly.
Oh, right. Okay.
That went on to become a film called Serenity, and they have very recently launched an Indiegogo campaign called Conman, which is currently busy smashing all sorts of records on the platform and raising tremendous amounts of money. They've already hit the 1.3 million mark as we speak.
Yeah.
Do you feel that's the kind of thing where, obviously both of these people work within the industry, they've had success, to varying extents on their own shows. Do you feel like this is something that really that is not their kind of arena? They shouldn't be there?
Well, I think there's a certain sense to which it's slightly disingenuous, perhaps. I mean, I'm not familiar with their campaign, so, I wouldn't want to comment so directly. I mean, the one that I had in mind was Zach Braff's campaign, which was, this is a guy who's already directed 2 feature films. He's, knows what the market was, and his sentiment was that I want the money because I want complete creative control. Well, very few directors have complete creative control, and it just seemed, slightly as if he was preserving all the back end in terms of his, profit participation through gaining effectively a kind of charitable contribution from the people who were then going to go and pay and see the movie as well. So he was sort of, it felt like he was charging people twice, as opposed to someone that's just trying to raise, say, $50,000 to make their low budget first feature. But, maybe that's me being ungenerous.
No, I find this really interesting. No, I find this very interesting. What you're talking about here is very specifically the nature of maintaining creative control, not necessarily the fundraising aspect here, which I think is a really interesting kind of aspect to drill into, because obviously Joe can speak to this a little bit more in depth, but one of the natures of the digital platforms that we live within and social media platforms that we live within is very much just the idea of collaboration and interaction, and the notion that somebody is trying to use a crowdfunding platform, which in and of its nature is social, to maintain creative control and therefore keep people outside of the conversation is a very, very interesting notion. I mean, what's your take on that, Joe?
The vast majority of the times when you've got crowd opinion or crowdfunding involved, it's almost self-censoring in a sense. So if, for instance, I would have hoped, and the majority of examples I've seen is, if it was the collective opinion that this director trying to maintain creative control through crowdfunding wasn't necessarily the right way to do it in terms of people not agreeing with that approach, like you, Oliver, therefore that would have been reflected in the result in terms of how many people would have chosen to fund it, in a sense. It's what we see most of the time with mass communities, is if people are trying to take advantage of that collective social crowdsourcing type environment or the benefits that can be gained from it, it backfires because of the amount of people which are behind it and controlling that opinion. So if it takes, from my view would be, I don't know, you might tell me this is completely wrong, but if there was 2 or 3 opinions which are similar to yours, Oliver, in terms of the people which are funding, that would snowball and be escalated and communicated on a wider scale, which would then have a knock-on effect to the overall amount of funding that was required. In this particular case, am I completely wrong? Was he extremely successful, or was it?
I think in the end he got all the money that he was looking for. I suppose what's interesting about what you're saying is that it feels like a highly democratic process, but in a way it sort of just replicates the kind of the model of the free market, which so it's a strange thing where suddenly the individual people, even just through tiny amounts of money that they might be investing in places, are acting as this sort of democratized market, which on one hand, my instinct on that is that it sounds brilliant because, for example, maybe Zach Braff has a really good point and he needs complete creative control for what he wants to do, and he feels that he wants to make this movie and he doesn't think that there's a good chance people aren't going to see it, so no studio is going to pay for it. It doesn't mean it's not a good thing for him to be doing. On the other hand, breaking up all those structures like that is part of the thing that film is challenging is a challenge to cope with. I think overall it is a good thing.
But it's interesting, I think, in terms of Joe's example. If we look at the example then of Veronica Mars, which also went through a crowdfunding process and did get picked up for distribution, and ultimately the fans weren't happy with the outcome, and I forget now who it was that distributed it, but they actually offered refunds on the original Kickstarter campaign.
Yeah.
So I think that there is some truth there in what Joe is saying in terms of there becomes this democracy of people that we need to keep happy in that process. And if the expectation isn't met, then what do we do?
Well, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that, already you have, you have a structure in a lot of films of the concept of the auteur, is quite prevalent in filmmaking. Well, if on the one hand people are funding the auteur so they can realise their creative vision, but then the overwhelming majority of those people decide that the result is the wrong, vision, or that it has been realised in the wrong way, you could end up in an endless cycle of things like that. And actually, generally, films have an awful lot of people already putting in an awful lot of creative thought and thinking, and sometimes too many, and you end up with the giraffe rather than the horse designed by a committee. And it's either a sort of brilliant way of sidestepping that, or it's ploughing straight into it and, not ending up with a horse, but ending up with a donkey.
Tiffany, I'm curious to hear your viewpoint in terms of you're working with a lot of the younger generation, and in the Future 8 Awards there is a category there for filmmaking. Whether or not you think that there are any emerging trends with the kind of youth filmmaking audience here in terms of leveraging this kind of notion of social audience and fandom and audience before a film has actually gone into production?
Absolutely. I think probably a better example is if I talk about our music category winner. I think the thing that was astonishing across all of the categories and the category winners was the fact that they really see social media and self-promotion as a part and parcel of what they do. So kind of without fail, they would be self-promoting their entries, their various different projects. Our film winner, Finn Morehouse, actually had, as a 15-year-old boy, had a huge body of work, I think about 50 different short films that he'd made that were all of such incredible quality that he really promoted. But Natalie Shea, who was our music winner, is just so kind of active on various different social media channels. She's on Instagram, she's got kind of fan follower accounts on Instagram, she's always on Twitter, she's currently at the moment promoting her Snapchat channel. She's already launched a single, she's going to launch an EP, but she is going to do that solely via social media. So we kind of spoke about her entering larger competitions and whether she'd want to get a record deal as a kind of 16-year-old teenager, but she said no, that she really wanted to go down that social media route to launch herself that way.
I find that interesting. So she had the opportunity there to kind of enter into what many people would consider as the professional and very kind of formal world of music making, but she chose to take a step back from that, and that's an interesting step in terms of being more focused on this notion of social engagement and creating conversation with her audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. So she's kind of consistently talking to her fans and really building up this huge database of fans before she's even really launched anything. So it's a really, really interesting concept, because you have to think that when she does come to sell an album, she's already got this great kind of database of fans that she's been talking to on a daily basis who feel like they know her and want to support her. And then so buying the album is just another extension of that.
So, question then, there are a lot of similarities here and kind of parallels in terms of the journey that Ella Henderson took with her music career. However, she chose a platform such as the X Factor to really kind of accelerate that growth of social audience. Do we think that this is something that adds value to the opportunity and the journey for young people, the notion of reality TV as a platform, or do we think that's perhaps damaging to credibility and being taken seriously by the formal industries as such?
I think that a platform like X Factor can be a really, really great way of gaining a lot of social media followers. And I think that it's really up to the individual to then convert that and really put across your message and try as much as possible to kind of work with the media and be very self-aware, so that actually it has a positive effect. Because I think the issue is that to make good TV, the editing doesn't always reflect that the person behind what's actually happening, and that can be an issue. So I think for young people, we work with 7 to 17-year-olds, that could be very, very daunting. So I think that there needs to be a great support system in place if you are going to go for something like that.
Oliver, what's your thought on that from a filmmaking perspective? Do we think that reality TV as a platform process in somebody's burgeoning career is a credible and logical route to follow these days?
Well, I think it's still just the nature of celebrity. I mean, it was fascinating listening to what Tiffany was saying. It actually reminded, I was just thinking about the volume of work that these kids are producing. They sound, when you list it all out, they must just be working all the time, pretty much. And it reminded me a little bit of Elvis, actually. The kind of, the pop star turned movie star turned, army spokesman turned all these different things. I think the reality is that anything that, increasing numbers of people will be interested in you and will, follow you in one way or another has always been a model that certainly Hollywood stars are familiar with, because it's audience, it's people in the theatres. I think there is still a certain something about film, although maybe I would say that and certainly I think it's something that film has always been keen to preserve, that it's not quite, if you're Kim Kardashian, you're an extremely powerful and influential figure in the world, but whether that converts to movies, the particular brand of movie star glamour is a slightly different thing. And I think that you could essentially term it a snobbery, and I think that snobbery to a certain extent is going to get turned over a little bit. Certainly, I was listening to a thing with the producer of the Transformers movie, and the whole franchise, and then Transformers 4, which was specifically designed to appeal to both the American and Chinese market. Some of their Chinese casting were reality TV stars from China, not necessarily the most famous Chinese actors. So I think that is beginning to change. And I think certain actors certainly are aware of that, and actors' presence on Twitter and that kind of thing, although that seems such old hat now.
Do you think though that this is a valid method for, say, people who are behind the camera versus in front of the camera? So, for example, that notion of building support and fandom around the individual filmmaker. So perhaps Joss Whedon would be a good example. He has a very, very strong fan base of people who follow him individually and his work. So by the time he got to doing things like the Avengers, he already had a very significant following and was probably very high profile by comparison to some other filmmakers that may have been vying for that position.
Oh, certainly. I mean, I think that the thing that's one of the many brilliant things about Joss Whedon, though, is that he's very straight about, that he in supporting the team that works around him, and Bad Robot, is as much a brand for people who know that as Joss Whedon is. And they've done some spectacularly clever little things in terms of, you know, the promotion of their movies. You know, they created, I'm sure you're all aware, the app to sort of Hollywood actionize your own little film. So you could film something on your iPhone and then put in a plane, you know, or a car wreck or, you know, whatever. Nothing to do with any of their films specifically, but just sort of replicating those film tropes. And then when, you know, his sort of big blockbuster films, you know, started coming out, you could get, you know, them branded according to that film, and you could get certain pieces, you know, from the Star Trek movie into your film, and they started building that way, and that became a promotional tool each time they gave out new free things that you could edit into your videos. So he's certainly, you know, done that brilliantly. But of course, it's also followed up by the fact that he is an absolutely stunning filmmaker. And if he wasn't as brilliant as he is, I don't think it would work, because I think, you know, the audiences are extremely discerning.
Okay, so talent has to definitely be there. But I think it is interesting what you're talking about there, which is the notion that part of that process with the app that you're describing was very much giving a piece of the kind of ownership, if you like, and putting a stakeholding into the IPs and the franchises that he was working on back to his own fandom. Joe, how do we feel about that as a process, as a way of engaging with our audiences to actually share something of our work and our IPs and our franchises with the audience, to really get them engaged and give them essentially a stakeholding in kind of being committed to that journey that we're taking as the individual?
I think it's of huge value to, I think this goes back to what Tiffany said a moment ago, which was really interesting about it's how people convert the following that they've managed to gather. I think using this democratic model opens up a whole mass of opinion, and followings can connect with somebody based upon the quality of their creative output, and also various different smaller elements which allow people to connect with people. You get very successful individuals who don't necessarily have particularly strong talent or creative output, but they have huge followings, and they've managed to convert those followings as a result of being able to connect with people. Dare I say, things like Jedward, you know, they've got mass followings through being put within that democratic process with X Factor or whatever. So I think it's a really interesting balance between quality of creative output, stroke quality of how they are converting and engaging with that mass audience which they have.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having a listen, guys. At this point, unfortunately, the group did continue to talk, and as I promised in the very beginning, if we go over what looks like it's going to be more than half an hour, I would split these into separate episodes for you. So if you want to hear the rest of this conversation and hear exactly where this conversation led, then listen to next week's episode. And don't forget to subscribe, give us your review, let us know what you think. Do you want to see a particular type of jam? Is there a specific industry that you'd like to hear from, or a combination of industries that you'd like to see in the same conversation? Then let us know at digitaljamsessions.com.